Hey everybody, welcome back to another installment of Speaking of Sundara, where I talk about Sundara Dawn of a New Age, my fantasy RPG setting for Pathfinder and D&D 5e. For folks who saw the last episode, my face is back. I have a slightly different camera, so the perspective is a little off and I'm still playing with it, but hopefully this means that y'all get to keep seeing me and Jaeger if he deigns to join us today. But without further ado, I wanted to get back into it, and I have one more City of Sundara to cover from the original 5 releases. Whether there's going to be more cities will partially depend on you all, so if you want to see this series expand and continue, let me know, leave a comment down below, and if you have a particular thing you'd like to see in a City of Sundara going forward, throw it out there. Who knows, it might make the final cut. But today I wanted to talk about Silkgift, which is the third installment of the series, and as I mentioned, the only one I haven't covered yet. And Silkgift found itself in kind of an unusual situation, both thematically and, I suppose, fantastically, as it's not as crazy as some of the ones I've put out, but I think it has something unique to offer that folks might be sleeping on. So, without further ado, I'll give you the brief history of the city and how it kind of became what it is, and I'll sort of point out the themes and what I was trying to do with it, see if a little glimpse behind the curtain gets folks more interested. But as to the history of Silkgift, like lots of places, it started out as a collection of small towns. It's a coastal city. It's right there near good fishing. It's kind of far away from travel lanes, so people would come there occasionally, but not really all that often unless there was a storm that blew them far enough inland and they needed to make repairs, get new equipment, things like that. But what made the city really unique, there was a single trade, a single product that it made that once word of it spread, people started paying attention. And it was, as the name implies, it was sailing silk, or sailcloth. And you could get sailcloth all kinds of places. It's a fantasy RPG setting. There's ships going up and down the coasts, all along the rivers. What made Silkgift special? And the answer to that is they had a particular plant there, considered a weed by most people. It was very tough, it was very fibrous. There really was no way to get rid of it. Most people just ignored it. It grew in other places, but no one had thought to take it and spin it into a cloth. And they found that once they did that, it was astonishingly tough. It was very, very difficult to work with, but once you figured out the secret, you could do it. And the result was you had a sailcloth that lasted years and years and years beyond what anything else would. So it was more difficult to produce, it was more expensive up front, but you had entire ships who would refit themselves in this little town once and not have to do it again for a decade or more, and that was nearly unheard of. There was no magical properties to this, there was no weird, unusual sorcery, it was just a strange use of a local plant that no one else had really thought of. But because once it was made, they didn't have to go through and constantly refit everything, all of the sailing ships really were fine once they had the necessary cloth. Then Silkgift's guild started putting up things like windmills, other things that would use the cloth, but it never really grew into a larger than a collection of a couple of towns until the arrival of a dwarven woman known as Clever Elsie. And Elsie attempted to join the guild, as many other people did, if she wanted to make this cloth. And she didn't quite make the cut. What she did do, though, was revolutionize how they made their looms. And she had been working in mining camps, she had been in various other places where engineering was required. And so when the loom was too inefficient, so she tried a new form of lubricant, she altered where certain things were set up, and the people in charge of the guild, being very wise, noted that if you could produce more in less time, particularly of a difficult to produce material that was worth a lot of money, you may have just found yourselves a new guild member. And so after they saw what Elsie had done, they asked her, well, what other improvements would you make to the process? And she showed them. And eventually, and by eventually I mean 5 to 10 years, the whole process was nearly automated. It was run using water pumped up from the bay, and it ran down the hills, thus creating a system that required a lot less muscle and a lot fewer people to actually produce the product that they needed. And at this point, they sort of looked at Elsie and said, well, what else would you suggest? And Clever Elsie sort of founded what would eventually become the Ingenieurs, which ended up becoming Silkgift's major industry, not necessarily sailcloth, but creativity, engineering, invention. And so eventually that particular side of the guild made so much money that the three towns grew into one city, and the one city just kept growing larger. But it wasn't until Clever Elsie's greatest accomplishment, so to speak, there were lots of people involved, but it was at least partially her idea, that Silkgift became a major city and a major power structure. And it was the creation of the Great Canal. Because Silkgift was on the water, it was on the ocean, but it was not really near a trading route. It was kind of inland. It was out of the way for anyone who wanted to go there. People still went there in order to get their product, but mainly the sailcloth was moved overland to other places. The creation of the Great Canal meant that they could now cut straight through land for miles and miles and miles and miles, and it put them on the map because it was safer, it was more reliable, and it had a lot of other benefits that going out on the open ocean just didn't have, and the fee was minimal. And so Silkgift became a center of trade, but also with so many different peoples coming from so many different parts of Sundara, you now had all of these unique goods, you had all sorts of new methods of engineering, new forms of alchemy, all forms of science just coming through here, in addition to the usual magic and monsters. And so Silkgift became extraordinarily cosmopolitan, and as a result of that, you now have all kinds of people from all across the setting just living, working, creating in this one place. And that's kind of become what Silkgift is known for, of its sort of a benign hive of mad scientists, for lack of a better term. Everyone's trying to find different ways, unique ways to do things using the technology and engineering they have available at this period's the wrong word, as folks who caught the earlier installment of that. But they are kind of working with the tools that they have available and figuring out how to do things with the materials they have. And that's sort of what gets to the heart of what I think makes Silkgift an interesting part of the setting. Is so often, as I mentioned before in a previous installment where I talked about period and technology and how things so often work in fantasy settings, we get caught up in this idea that technology, science, learning is stagnant in our fantasy settings. And we so often fail to look at our actual real world history and ask, well, what were people capable of in the Bronze Age, in the Iron Age? What are some of the feats of engineering that maybe have been lost to time or that weren't common at certain points in history, like after the fall of Rome, but that we were completely capable of as a species before that? And then ask, all right, what if you took that and then added a fantasy element to it? What would that create? And so it's a thing that I think is interesting in Silkgift of it's not Magitech, as people have so often asked, but it's the question of taking things that humans were capable of hundreds of years ago that we tend to think of as modern inventions and just using them as the basis for making a unique setting both aesthetically and practically. A good example of that is compressed air. Compressed air technology is something we think of as a very modern invention, whether it's air pistols or pneumatic tools or things like that. And it's been around a lot longer than that. It wasn't as efficient, obviously, and it wasn't always as powerful, but it was something people were perfectly capable of as far back as the Renaissance. And so, as I mentioned in the setting, if you take something like Dragonsteel, from the city of Ironfire, and you combine it with the inventiveness and ingenuity of the Ingeneurs, you end up with Aether technology, which is sort of how I have compressed air weapons in this particular part of the setting. So if you like firearms but you don't want to deal with black powder, it's a fun little mix of the two. It was inspired by the Ghirardoni air rifle for folks who are curious about that little piece of Italian engineering. But you also see it with things like the water pumps. There's screw pumps, which go all the way back to ancient Greece, and it's essentially just a very firmly fit screw that turns in the water, and as it turns, it brings water up from the lower section to the higher section using basic mechanical principles. And if you attach that to a windmill, you now have a mostly automated water pump. And if you can take water and put it all the way at the top of a hill, you now have all the potential energy, and as it runs down, it can power a machine, whether it's something for a blacksmith shop of powering the trip hammer that they use, or if it's running a loom, anything, even primitive automation like that can really change the way that you manufacture things at this level of society and technology. And that's kind of what I wanted to do with Silkgift. But I took a further step with that because we'd seen automation in other parts of the setting, whether it was using the undead in Maud or using magic in Archbliss. But I wanted to ask that question of what happens when automation isn't used as a tool to force your working population to do more hours or threatening to replace them with a machine if they complain too much. And what you have is Silkgift is it's not a paradise. Let's not get ridiculous here. This isn't that kind of fantasy. But it is a city that values its people over profits. So you have a city where if you want to live there, you get a house, you have food, you have a place, yeah, you have not necessarily idle time, but you have opportunities for education, which has been made free to the public because you might be very smart, much like Clever Elsie, but if you have to spend all your time and energy earning a wage, you're not going to have time to paint great paintings, make new inventions, write poetry, be a musician. None of that's going to work. So the city, as a result, focuses on using machinery as much as it can to produce what it needs. So that way, everybody has all of this idle time that they can put forth to bettering themselves and creating new things. A result of that is there's very little crime in Silkgift. It's not unheard of, obviously, but the crime that you do run into tends to be less street muggings and banditry, the things we're used to seeing in fantasy RPGs. And we have more like industrial espionage, as people are trying to steal secrets or sabotage other people's work so that they don't, change an industry too much. You have outside influences of people trying to work arms deals from groups that have been determined by the city. No, we don't want to have any dealings with these people. They're going to do things we don't approve of with our inventions. And so Silkgift has a very unusual feel as far as fantasy settings go, and it's kind of hard to get a grip on it. And it was the first installment of the city that I put in a sort of a disclaimer at the end of it, explaining to game masters of there are certain types of plots that, by the nature of this place, just aren't going to work. But at the same time, there are other plots that wouldn't work in other places you can do here, whether that's science run amok, whether that's something went horribly wrong at the various idea works, or if you have someone from I called them boomers because their inventions tend to explode. But there's a whole area of the city which are just people who have been either run out of or been told they're not welcome in certain places, and they come here to sort of refine and practice their sciences and their ideologies. And it can lead to some brilliant results. It can lead to a lot of fires. So it's really going to depend on what the results happen to be that week. But that's kind of what folks get with Silkgift. It's a place that's very unusual, but it's also a place that I think encapsulates something we don't see a lot of in fantasy RPGs, of that question of what kind of accomplishments can we have as a people, as a species, as a setting, without magic, but using the sort of unusual flora, fauna, and learning that you find in a place, but making it accessible to everybody rather than just something known only to a select guild of wizards or only found near certain arcane colleges or things like that. It's that question of what happens when education, when invention, when creation is used to better an entire place, and what kind of example does that set for the rest of the setting. But I've rambled on enough about that. There's a lot of fun specifics in it if folks want to pick it up. Links should be in the description wherever it is in this particular setup. And there's creatures, there's the aether weapons I spoke of, there's the maps, there's the more detailed history of the setting, which I kind of gave a general setup of, and there's plot hooks for folks who want it done by neighborhood. So whether or not you want to do something sort of in the back alleys near the district of the actual mad scientists, or if you want to do something with international espionage, or well, we don't have nations, but the term will work. Or if you want to do something more with threats to the city from outside, of maybe there's a pirate fleet who's decided that they're going to make a go for it and try to take what they need, whether there's traders who are attempting to disguise themselves to get around an embargo, all sorts of things are going on. So that's an option. And regarding future installments, both the setting and the series of in the comments below if there's a particular part of the setting I haven't covered yet, whether it's a species, whether it's something from one of the towns, whether it's an older installment where I talked about some fun stuff but I left out a aspect you felt was more important. Let me know. I'm not out of topics, but I am at the point where I'm willing to hear what folks want to hear more of. And yeah, until next time, happy gaming, everybody.